The Unspoken Demographic: How Sexuality and Gender Identity Influence Experiences in Poverty. In 2019, LGBTQ Americans collectively had a 6% higher poverty rate than that of their cisgender straight counterparts. For some, this meant that they experienced homelessness and had to turn to shelters, many of which practiced discriminatory practices against the LGBTQ community. For others, this meant being turned away from jobs and employment that they were qualified for by all relevant metrics. For more still, this meant merely another year of discrimination, harassment, and injustice from their own government. This pattern is not new, with heteronormative and cisnormative roots in the U.S. extending far back before the U.S. government existed. As early as 1674, the French explorer Jacques Marquette was commenting derogatorily on his observation of two spirit individuals. More recently, however, the Lavender Scare of the mid-20th century saw hundreds of LGBTQ Americans both ousted from their jobs and denied entry into the federal workplace on the basis of their sexuality. Today, LGBTQ Americans still face discrimination and injustice daily, to the extent that it affects their very livelihood. The experience of LGBTQ individuals in poverty is an underrepresented issue that, if Rawls's veil of ignorance is to be truly maintained, requires scholars and students to lean into their empathy, challenge themselves to see further than what is available in their own lives, and dedicate themselves to improving the well-being and liberty of LGBTQ individuals everywhere. The first step to understanding the issue of poverty in the LGBTQ community is to understand how it occurs. The most common pathway is childhood poverty, so much so that 73% of LGBTQ adults in poverty report experiencing economic insecurity as children. This is especially important considering the existing research from Curry, Duncan, and Magnuson about the role of critical periods in childhood development. If an individual is raised in poverty before and after birth, they have a higher chance of being in poverty later in adulthood. Still, this cannot explain the high rates of poverty in the LGBTQ community, as childhood poverty is not endemic to LGBTQ individuals. Here, there are merely hypothetical answers, as some variables are difficult to measure, and there are many gaps in research on LGBTQ poverty. One proposal is that the education system fails to protect LGBTQ students from unwelcoming peers and teachers, to the extent that their educational trajectory is disrupted, and these students face challenges when pursuing post-secondary education. Another hypothesis is that hostility and lack of support from family members might lead to difficulties gaining financial assistance, and even lead some teenagers to be kicked out of their home. These pathways are immensely important to understanding the experiences of LGBTQ individuals in poverty, but also point to a clear gap in the existing research. Other than research, there are also several gaps in the legal protections for LGBTQ Americans, gaps that could otherwise keep them out of poverty. In 2014, the Center for American Progress and Movement Advancement Project worked together to identify the main legislative gaps, the largest of which discussed how LGBTQ individuals can become unable to access necessary health care, be refused housing, or be fired, all because of their identity. Today, almost a decade later, those issues still thrive. According to a Movement Advancement Project report from 2023, 44% of the LGBTQ population resides in states that don't have state-mandated LGBTQ insurance protections. Furthermore, they found that 26% of the LGBTQ population of state employees lives in states that explicitly exclude gender-affirming care from its state employee health benefits. Even if they do have access to health care, more than 1 in 6 LGBTQ adults report avoiding health care due to anticipated discrimination, including 22% of transgender adults specifically. As for housing access, nearly 30% of LGBTQ adults in 2022 reported experiencing housing discrimination or harassment as a result of their identity. This could include being wholly prevented from purchasing a home, being denied access to a shelter, the very place intended to protect individuals from homelessness, or experiencing discriminatory harassment from neighbors. Considering Matthew Desmond's previous research on how redlining and being barred from home ownership has affected the Black community in America, there appears to be substantial evidence that home ownership is closely tied with poverty. As of June 2023, the Fair and Equal Housing Act was introduced in Congress, which would add sexual orientation and gender identity into explicitly protected characteristics under the existing Fair Housing Act. This bill has since made almost no progress and received essentially zero media coverage. On a positive note, in 2020, the U.S. Supreme Court enshrined protection from employment discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity into federal law, though the effectiveness of this order will be discussed further in time. While employment is now federally protected, national legislative protections for housing discrimination and healthcare access don't exist. These gaps in legal protections mean that LGBTQ individuals have significantly less governmental assistance in keeping out of poverty. The discussion surrounding employment and its role in LGBTQ poverty merits a longer review. As discussed above, there is a history in the United States of denying members of the LGBTQ community certain high-paying employment opportunities. The term for this is the Lavender Scare. In the storm of McCarthyism, President Dwight D. Eisenhower's Executive Order 10,450 barred gay men and lesbian women from holding positions in the federal government, on the basis that they would be more susceptible to blackmail because of their supposedly weak moral characters. That order technically existed in 2017, when Barack Obama signed Executive Order 13,764, explicitly repealing Executive Order 10,450. This history can't simply be wiped away. These stereotypes and prejudices still exist. As discussed above, the U.S. Supreme Court declared employment discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity prohibited under federal law, only 3 years after former President Obama's order. However, when asked if they had experienced some form of workplace discrimination in 2022, including being fired, being denied a promotion, having their hours cut, or experiencing direct harassment, 50% of LGBTQ adults reported discrimination. While the legal protections for workplace discrimination exist, they clearly aren't successful. Furthermore, even if LGBTQ individuals are hired, they still experience discriminatory practices that bar them from being safe in the workplace. In Bianca Wilson's interviews with LGBTQ workers in California, one individual, Tyler, told his story as a bisexual transgender man. There have been few places that have been like, no, sorry, we're going to use like your birth name because that's what it is on your whatever. I'm like, it's fine. You have to use that in the paperwork. Like, I understand that, but on my name tag, can I just have my preferred name? And can you use the right pronouns? Like, that's literally all I ask. And they would be like, no. Despite being hired and welcomed on paper, he then faces discrimination for simply wanting to be called by his name. This creates a hostile workplace environment that can degrade one's mental health and eventually lead one to quit their job, which is exactly what Tyler did. If facing homelessness, whether due to lack of employment or other reasons, many individuals turn to shelters. For members of the LGBTQ community, which make up a whopping 40% of the youth experiencing homelessness, this transition is significantly more difficult. They may face discrimination from faith-based organizations, which provide for over 40% of the beds for single individuals, and experience discussed by Ralph in Wilson's interviews. They may be unsafe in shelters, as transgender women are perceived by the entire LGBTQ community as unsafe in any shelter, whether it's co-ed or women's. Furthermore, they may face violations and eventually be barred from the shelter entirely because of their sexuality. In an interview, 19-year-old Tori discussed how she was cited at her shelter for a public display of affection with her female partner, when she often saw heteronormative couples engage in the same displays without any repercussions. Numerous citations of this kind would lead to a suspension from the shelter. When faced with these numerous barriers, LGBTQ individuals often are unable to turn to a shelter in the same way that a straight individual might, barring them from receiving the same support while working to get on their feet and battle the grip of poverty. In recent years, another complication has arisen in the world of poverty studies, though this issue has affected LGBTQ individuals significantly more than their straight and cisgender counterparts: COVID-19. While healthcare was already a weighty issue for the LGBTQ community, as discussed earlier, a global pandemic led to serious poverty-related issues beyond the realm of mere health. During the pandemic, almost 5 times as many transgender people of color as white cisgender people experienced food insufficiency, a reflection of both intersectionality and inequality. As for employment, LGBTQ individuals, specifically those that are transgender, experienced significant unemployment and pay cuts resulting from the pandemic. 19% of transgender people and 17% of LGBTQ people became unemployed due to COVID-19, compared to 12% of the general population. Additionally, 27% of transgender people received a pay cut due to the pandemic, compared to 10% of LGBTQ people and 7% of the general population. While the effects of the pandemic are still being discussed in the wide category of poverty studies, its effects on the LGBTQ community in particular have been massively undercovered and warrant further research, attention, and solutions. Another factor in the experiences of LGBTQ individuals in poverty, one that might not appear as obvious as employment, healthcare, or housing, is police presence. Michelle Alexander's research discusses how policing and hyper-incarceration are mechanisms for racial inequality and poverty, to the extent that she proposes this era be entitled the New Jim Crow. In the same way that the 1960s saw gay bars raided and individuals arrested for cross-dressing, being LGBTQ today significantly affects the magnitude with which certain people of color experience incarceration, extensive policing, and surveillance. When it comes to gaps in research, this phenomenon is a bit more commonly studied than other LGBTQ issues, likely due to its intersectionality and the previously existing research on people of color in poverty interacting with the police. In just a small portion of this research, it has been found that Black and brown youth who embody a more diverse expression of gender than the common binary are more often targeted by police, and that butch women, of color especially, are often considered more suspicious of criminal inclination by police. When discussing the crimes of existence, often referred to as walking while Black or walking while brown, a new facet must be added to address the experiences of people of color that don't merely walk around with their race displayed on their skin, but also display their sexuality, their gender identity, their deviance from the standard heteronormativity and binary of our American community. A 19-year-old Hispanic lesbian, Elena, expressed that in police interactions she was treated like a man. She said that, police say the same thing. Want to dress like a man? Going to beat you like a man. She said that police placed her in a men's cell. He knew I was a girl, but he put me in there for about 2 hours. I said, you better move me to that girl cell. I'm a girl. And then he was like, you want to be a man? Then I'll put you in a man's cell. It is targeting, it is harassment, it is injustice. Why would they turn to the police for help? The answer? They don't. With these police interactions comes a discussion surrounding incarceration. As many know, the U.S. incarcerates 25% of the world prison population, but is less than 5% of the world population. This is not a new statistic in poverty studies, but lesser discussed is the significance of sexuality in incarceration, specifically that LGBTQ people are 3 times more likely to experience incarceration than the general population. For youths, 15% of the individuals in juvenile detention are LGBTQ, though this community makes up only 5 to 8% of the U.S. population. The statistics only worsen for those that deviate from the norms of gender specifically, so much so that 1 in every 6 transgender people has experienced incarceration. When in the prison system, LGBTQ individuals face significantly more barriers than their straight and cisgender counterparts, whether it be due to discrimination from guards or fellow inmates. Compared with straight inmates, sexual minorities are more likely to have been sexually victimized while incarcerated, to have experienced solitary confinement and other punishments, and to report current psychological distress. When you consider the additional factor of this level of trauma, Deva Pager's research on re-entry after incarceration becomes that much more important. How can LGBTQ individuals find a place in the workforce after incarceration, not only because of that checked box, but also because of the existing discriminations in employment and the trauma of their experiences inside, unprotected by their government? The intersexual experience of LGBTQ individuals in poverty factors into almost every topic highlighted thus far. It is one of the reasons why the issue is so important in poverty studies. Among LGBTQ people, the highest poverty rates are seen among transgender and bisexual individuals, which soared as high as 29% in 2019 for both categories. However, when comparing lesbian and straight cisgender women to gay and straight cisgender men, there was around a 5% difference in the poverty rate, where women, regardless of sexuality, were more likely to experience poverty than men. That difference jumped to 10% when comparing bisexual women and bisexual men, though LGBTQ individuals saw higher rates of poverty across the board when compared to their cisgender or straight counterparts. In addition, poverty rates for transgender individuals jumped by about 10 or 20% for Black or Hispanic transgender individuals, respectively. The intersectionality of LGBTQ issues with racial issues is the one that merits the most attention, as it has in this discussion already, because the discrimination experienced by people of color is already so significant. At Tory's shelter, when she was cited for the public display of affection, she knew that she was lucky, as staff were more likely to suspend youth of color from the shelter for rule violations than her, a white woman. This experience is common among white members of the LGBTQ community, as their own experiences with discrimination can sometimes make them more aware of the worse experiences had by their fellow community members that happen to also be non-white. Some, like Cora, express how their whiteness helps them pass as cisgender. I'm still at a point where, if I choose to, I can pass as being just like a straight white man who everyone's going to treat that way. Others, like Vasilis, discuss how their whiteness lets them get away with expressing their non-binary identity. I could have it a lot worse, but at the end of the day, my whiteness gives me more humanity. Like, I'm allowed to be gender deviant in a way that a lot of trans people of color aren't allowed to do. Being a man, being white, these are factors that help some members of the community survive. The opposite, being a woman, being black, Hispanic, anything other than white, these factors mean that their LGBTQ identity may not even be the first factor in the discrimination against them, the discrimination that results in poverty. The experiences of LGBTQ individuals in poverty are wide and varied as the community itself. Some members of the community face little discrimination, some face more discrimination due to different parts of their identity, and some face serious discrimination due to their gender identity or sexuality, to the extent that they live in poverty. Dorothy Allison discusses how, for her, being in poverty led to being othered. For members of the LGBTQ community, poverty comes after being othered. It is not a consequence, it is a cause. The othering of LGBTQ individuals is exactly what Rawls warned against in The Veil of Ignorance, challenging humanity to enact rules that would protect everyone, as each person never knew if they would be worst off. For individuals that are against the LGBTQ community, whether it be due to personal opinions, religious influences, or negative experiences, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would challenge them to treat everyone as if they were family, no matter where they came from or how different they were, as every single person in the human race is a member of the same family on earth, the world house. No individual should be left behind in order to benefit others. No individual should be forgotten, because everyone is a member of the same community of humanity. To ignore this, to ignore the plights of LGBTQ individuals living in poverty, is to ignore the foundational empathy that separates humankind from simple animal, living from merely existing, and caring from basic apathy.